All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome. Everybody joining us here physically, as well as our virtual participants. So we're officially starting our joint dialogue on the new partnership for on the new agenda for peace, with a specific focus on what it means for AU-UN partnership. So I just would like to thank UN-AU for joining us, Amani Africa, as we convene this event. I would also like to extend our specific gratitude to the Norwegian Embassy for its partnership with Africa, with Amani Africa, on and its support as we convene this event. So yeah, I will just hand over to our moderator, Nicolas Shalita. Yes, please take the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, can I just encourage those who are seated at the back, if you could kindly move forward so that those participants who are coming later can fill the back seats without necessarily interrupting deliberations. Thank you very much for your cooperation in that. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the AU-UN partnership, I'd like to welcome you to this panel discussion. Both those who are attending in person here at the Hayat Hotel, but also those who are attending virtually. The theme of today's discussion, I think, is a very timely one. It's reimagining the AU-UN partnership in peace and security. And it is reimagining that AU-UN partnership within the context of the new agenda for peace. The meeting, as we've heard, is taking place in a hybrid format, sorry. So we've got participants both here in the room, but also virtually. So I'd like to welcome all of you. And as Sion said, this meeting is within the partnership agreement between UN-AU and Amani Africa, to whom we thank you profoundly for that cooperation. I would also just like to apologize for the postponement of the meeting last week. We had to postpone it for reasons that were beyond our control. But I'm glad that as the year winds down, I'm glad that we nevertheless were able to convene the meeting. So just a brief introduction of the panel to begin with. We have Mr. Gerald Mitchell to my right. He has extensive intergovernmental experience in political affairs, elections, peace building issues. Prior to his appointment by the UN Secretary General to UN-AU as the Deputy Head of Office and Director of Political Affairs, he served in United Nations Special Political Missions and the UNDP in Somalia, Afghanistan, Georgia, and Ethiopia. He has also previously served for several years as the Head of Elections with the OSCE. His career focus has been on issues of inclusive governance and democratic elections in transitional and post-conflict countries in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and the CIS. He holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Washington, and a master's degree in comparative government from the London School of Economics and Political Science. We are also honored and privileged to have Ambassador Fred Gateretse Ngoga, who's participating, as you can see, virtually. Welcome, Fred. Fred is a Burundian diplomat who is currently the Senior Advisor on International Partnerships, the AU Border Program, and Regional Security Mechanisms in the Office of the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security of the African Union. He's also served as head of Early Warning and Conflict Prevention Division in the Peace and Security Department. Ambassador Ngoga has also served in AMISOM and engaged particularly in providing support on counterterrorism and in the planning of military operations in line with AMISOM's mandate. So welcome, Fred. And of course, we've also got Dr. Solomon Desso, who needs no introduction in Addis, but nevertheless, I'll just say something about him. He's a leading legal scholar, an analyst on peace and security, and current African and AU affairs. Dr. Desso serves as the Commissioner for African Commission for Human and People's Rights, the premier human rights body of the African Union. Formerly, he worked as a head of the Peace and Security Council Report Program in ISS after serving as a senior researcher, which he assumed in 2009. So welcome to the panel. So, ladies and gentlemen, the objectives of this panel discussion is threefold. Firstly, to share the experiences and to take stock of the AU-UN partnership in peace and security. Secondly, to discuss the new agenda for peace and its implications on the AU-UN partnership. And thirdly, to provide policy insights and identify possible approaches to strengthening the AU-UN partnership in alignment with the envisaged expectations to be placed on the two organizations. The new agenda for peace, just to give some background on the new agenda for peace, it's the policy brief 9, which is an input towards the preparation for the Summit of the Future in 2024, and forms some action-orientated recommendations. For today's discussion, if you allow, I'd like us to focus on 4 key areas of the new agenda for peace. I'm sure most of you have had the opportunity to read it, but I'd like us to focus really on 4 main areas. Firstly, strengthening multilateralism and collective security. Secondly, diplomacy for peace. Thirdly, responding to conflict and violence. And fourthly, the nexus approaches, coordination and collaboration across various thematic pillars. But the new agenda for peace, it says, to my mind, there are 5 things which I think are of particular relevance to what we're trying to address today. The first thing, the Secretary General acknowledges that there's a deep sense of unease, which is growing, that governments and international organizations have failed to deliver for them. There's a deep mistrust and suspicion between and within nations, and a normative challenge with competing interpretations of international law. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say, and if you just watch the news on any day, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that we are facing a crisis of multilateralism. Despite the recognition that the rule of law is the foundation for fair, just, and peaceful societies, we are at grave risk of a rule of lawlessness. And these are not my words, but these are words from the New Agenda itself. Unless the second point, unless the benefits of international cooperation become more tangible and equitable, and unless states can manage their competition and move beyond their current divisions to find pragmatic solutions to global problems, then conflict and human suffering will worsen. The third point, the challenges that we face can be addressed only through strong international cooperation. And yet, as we see happening these days, global institutions are, in many cases, not fit for purpose. The fourth point, which I think is of relevance to our discussion today, that the collective security system that the United Nations embodies has recorded remarkable accomplishments. Peacemaking and peacekeeping have helped end wars and prevent numerous crises. However, peace remains elusive for many around the world, and the nature of conflict have evolved. And collective security system therefore needs to adapt to those challenges. And the final point, the New Agenda for Peace is, on the New Agenda for Peace is the recognition of the important role for regional organizations under Chapter 8 of the Charter, and specifically the AU and sub-regional organizations of Africa in addressing global peace and security challenges within a global collective security system. So those are my thoughts on how I think we should frame the discussion today. And so with that introduction, and apologies if I was a bit long-winded, but with that introduction, I'll hand over the floor firstly to Mr. Gerald Mitchell.
Thank you, Nicholas, and good afternoon. I thought I would just share a few remarks at the outset of our discussion, just perhaps to help frame the topic that we're here to discuss. And I think importantly, it's important to recognize that the UN Charter foresaw the importance of cooperation with regional institutions and arrangements in Chapter 8, notwithstanding the primacy of the UN Security Council for global peace and security. And I think we have to accept that this was visionary, necessary, and strategic, particularly given the complexity of today's peace and security challenges, from political and socio-economic exclusion to violent extremism and organized crime, to unconstitutional changes of government, all underscoring the need for the UN to work closely with regional and sub-regional organizations. As noted in the Secretary General's annual report on strengthening the partnership between the UN and the AU, regional organizations play a critical role in addressing contemporary threats across the conflict cycle, including in peace enforcement missions. The UN Secretary General's policy brief, A New Agenda for Peace, launched in July this year, further underscores the highly strategic value of the partnership. It emphasizes that rebuilding global consensus around shared norms will be an essential task of diplomatic efforts going forward, with Africa playing a pivotal role. The New Agenda for Peace, which is the result of extensive consultation with a range of stakeholders, including the African Union, sets out a vision for a more collective security machinery in a shifting world order, characterized by global power rivalry, rising inequality, and challenges to existing normative frameworks. It is therefore worth taking a moment to reflect on the 6 priority issues outlined by the African Union during these consultations, which offer insight into the AU's expectations of and vision for the partnership. Firstly, the AU called for a new peace operation doctrine that surpasses traditional peacekeeping in favor of the realities on the ground in complex, intractable conflicts where there is little peace to keep. In that regard, the AU underscored the need to deploy peace enforcement missions to address existing and emerging security threats more effectively. The AU also underscored the need for predictable, adequate, and sustainable financing of continental and regional peace operations through UN-assessed contributions. The Secretary-General has been steadfast in his support for AU access to assess contributions on a case-by-case basis for AU-led and UN Security Council mandated peace support operations. And in fact, by empowering AU-led peace support operations, the UN Security Council will also be empowering itself, strengthening its own hand in fulfilling its mandate to maintain international peace and security as outlined in Article 24 of the Charter. Given the Secretary-General's call for a new generation of peace enforcement missions and counterterrorism operations led by regional partners in accordance with the UN Security Council mandate, enhanced policy coordination at the strategic, institutional, and operational levels is essential. The 2017 UN-AU Partnership Framework provides the modalities for such coordination based on mutually agreed norms and underpins the Secretary-General's vision for cooperation with regional organizations in maintaining international peace and security. In the event that a framework resolution permits for AU-led operations accessing UN-assessed contributions, the UN will continue to support the AU in joint planning and analysis, and will draw upon the experience of the support model, as was the case in Somalia through UNSOS and formerly UNSOA. The UN will also continue to support the implementation of the AU Compliance and Accountability Framework, and in that regard, the recent signing of the UN-AU Joint Framework on Human Rights is an important and timely development, given that compliance is a key consideration of AU PSO financing. As you all probably know, the Security Council is considering a draft framework resolution drafted by the A3, which is due for consideration later this week in the Security Council. In addition to a doctrine that surpasses traditional peacekeeping, the AU also called for a reaffirmation of politics. The Secretary-General himself has stressed that diplomacy for peace requires robust political strategies at the very core of responses to peace and security challenges and consideration of how to operationalize political solutions, including with the full engagement of women and youth. Another point that the AU raised during the consultations on the new agenda for peace was a focus on national reconciliation. The new agenda for peace does underscore the need to enhance national, sub-regional, and regional capacities to prevent and manage conflict, and in that regard, it recognizes support for national prevention strategies that address root causes and the strengthening of national infrastructures for peace as essential. Another point was a focus on accountability and transitional justice. In this context, the recent signing of the UN-AU Human Rights Framework further underscores a joint commitment to international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and internationally recognized codes of military conduct and discipline. Another point, a focus on institutional capacity. And in this context, it is vital that the UN continues to support long-term capacity development and short-term operational support to the AU and REX in planning, deploying, and managing peace support operations. And finally, the AU placed a focus on smart partnerships, an important reminder that the UN-AU partnership is designed to strengthen coordination, leverage comparative advantages, and ensure complementarity between the two institutions to effectively prevent, manage, and resolve conflict. The new Agenda for Peace places a strong emphasis on global and regional early warning and response, boosting preventive diplomacy, and supporting regional peace enforcement operations, all areas in which the AU has shown commendable leadership. In addition, AU efforts to enhance APSA and AGA synergy is also a crucial step towards ensuring the effectiveness of these mechanisms and their timely response to emerging and ongoing conflict situations. Working through these established mechanisms, the full range of responses to conflict can be effectively supported and strengthened. However, while peace enforcement is important, there must also be progress on other tracks, including mediation, governance, and the peace, security, and development nexus, in order to address the structural and governance deficits that unfortunately are plaguing many African states. Furthermore, the AU and UN's commitment to strengthening democracy and advancing sustainable development is paramount to addressing challenges posed by state fragility, underdevelopment, and weak governance. To this end, the recent decision by the Secretary General and the AUC chairperson to establish a high-level strategic dialogue on sustainable development is exemplary of the AU and UN's shared holistic approach. I would also like to briefly recognize the joint UNDP and AU-led Africa Facility to support inclusive transitions that was launched in July, which provides support to countries facing complex political transitions. Taken together, our response to peace and security challenges must also be comprehensive, always be comprehensive and holistic. Peace and security cannot be separated from development, climate action, and the youth and women peace and security agendas as outlined in the new Agenda for Peace. This further underscores the need to address the root causes and drivers of conflict. For as we know, peace is not just the absence of violence. As Martin Luther King famously said, if peace means a willingness to be exploited economically and dominated politically, then I don't want peace. In that regard, the relationship between the political sphere and the economic system cannot be understated. Briefly, in terms of the council-to-council dimension, during the annual consultative meeting of the UN Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council in October, both councils expressed a strong commitment to strengthen collaboration, including more frequent consultative meetings, also at the expert level, as well as strong support to find mutually agreeable modalities that could permit joint field visits in the future. As we know, this has been an outstanding issue for some time, but certainly would strengthen the council-to-council's ability for joint analysis and joint messaging. Looking forward, during the November annual conference, the UN Secretary General and the AUC chairperson further underscored the need for Africa to have a strong voice and representation in global reform discussions, and recognized the Summit of the Future next year, planned for September, the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, and the World Summit, Future Summit in 2025, World Social Summit in 2025, as platforms to be leveraged for the reform of the global governance architecture and international financial institutions. Finally, given the current global environment, which, as we know and was referenced by Nicholas in the opening, at the same time, this perhaps provides an opportunity to rethink aspects of the multilateral system, including the UN-AU partnership, and consequently the new collective security approaches offered in the new Agenda for Peace should be bold, visionary, and fit for purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald. Thank you for your presentation. And but in particular, I think highlighting or recalling, reminding us of the 6 priority areas that the AU had identified as part of its engagements leading up to the development of the SG's policy brief. And in particular, also your reference to the issue of the primacy of politics, and which is captured in the new agenda, diplomacy for peace, and your reference to also the imperative to develop national and regional strategies and infrastructures for peace, as well as early warning and responses. I think there's a lot there that can be unpacked, and I'd like us to unpack it in the Q&A session, and in particular picking on the experience of Ambassador Fred, who's got a lot of experience in this area, but also of Dr. Solomon, and also recalling that any action in peace enforcement needs to be underpinned by a political process. And as you know, discussions are ongoing in the Security Council on this issue of the financing for AUPSOs, I think that's something that we need to keep at the very center of the discussion. That any peace enforcement mission needs to be underpinned by a political process. But thank you very much for those thoughts. I'll now hand over to Ambassador Fred for his intervention. Fred, over to you.
Nicholas, thank you so very much. I think Gerald highlighted some of the key points that I was going to highlight, because these were some of the agendas that we pushed for when we were asked about the new agenda for peace. But since he highlighted the primacy of politics, the need for peace enforcement, the need for national reconciliation, the need for strong states, because here strong states, we're underlying it, because for us, as far as we're concerned, many of our countries inherited administrations, but they didn't inherit states. And this is something that we're going to be emphasizing on more and more. The other element that we pushed for was strong partnerships as well, because we believe that despite all the challenges that multilateralism have, there is not a single organization that can actually deal with conflicts on its own. But let me just step back a bit and look at things from a different angle. Imagine you are a Peter or Mary who's sitting in an African country which is facing conflicts. What is it that you would like to see the UN do, or with the AU? You want them to take action to secure a cessation of hostilities. How are we doing with regards to that? I don't think that of late we have done as well as we should. And I think that this chairperson and the Secretary General have tried as much as they can, but our member states actually have been somewhat invoking sovereignty, and this has challenged us in terms of our peacemaking efforts. So I think that going forward, we need to engage our member states on the issue of sovereignty as a responsibility, but also the responsibility to protect. So the other thing that we need to ask ourselves is, how have we done in terms of renewing with diplomacy? I recall a couple of years ago, we were, every time that before a conflict would erupt, we would engage in preventive diplomacy and try to engage the parties so that we can avert a conflict. But of late, actually, even that opportunity is not often given to us. So we often tend also to perhaps put in place mechanism that gives us the comfort that we're doing something, but in reality not having an impact. And we need to revisit all of that and try to be innovative in our ways of doing peacemaking. The third point I think that I want to mention is the one that was mentioned by Gerald, which is about international law. We are concerned that international law is applied selectively, but yet at the same time, I think that the fact that we are facing these challenges is an opportunity to renew and to strengthen again international law. From a crisis, as they say, there is always an opportunity. And I think that this is something that we need to look forward into strengthening. The fourth and my last point here has to do with, to thank really some of the partners who have accompanied us in this journey. I said earlier that when the OAU transitioned to the African Union, there were two principles: sovereignty is a responsibility, and the responsibility to protect. And the progress that we have made has actually been possible because of strong partnerships, like the support of the European Union, the support of the UN. And I'm so pleased with where we are in terms of institutions collaboration. But at the end of the day, what matters and what needs to matter is our ability to have an impact in terms of preventing conflict, resolving conflicts, and also peace building. Let me conclude by also on the issue of financing. On the issue of financing, this conversation has started in 2015, and I'm so pleased in terms of the support that we have received from the Secretary General, and pleased also with the progress made. It is my hope that before the end of this year, we might have a resolution actually that charts a path for us to assess contribution as we seek to put in place peace enforcement operations underpinned by strong political process. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you in particular for highlighting the point of sovereignty as a responsibility, and the very strong position that the African Union has taken on this right from the outset in the Constitutive Act, Article 4H. But I think this is something I think we should discuss a bit further. How do we actually give life to that principle? How do we actually ensure that we don't constantly run into these challenges of certain countries invoking the principle of sovereignty and thereby frustrating the efforts of the international community to assist in resolving conflict? You mentioned the issue of the crisis that we're currently facing being an opportunity. And I think that's spot on. I believe that the crisis that we're facing in multilateralism today is an opportunity for the international community to shape the international system more broadly, and specifically the collective security architecture, in a way that is fairer and more equitable. The question that we have before us today is, how does the AU-UN partnership work together to bring that about? That's the question I think that we need to focus our minds leading up to the summit of the future and the negotiations that will be taking place before that, to ask that question and hopefully take actions to bring it about. I'll hand over now to Dr. Solomon for his intervention. Thank you.
A very good afternoon, distinguished ambassadors present, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for this very timely and important conversation that we have the privilege of organizing together with the United Nations Office to the African Union, UN-AU, to whom I would like to express Amani Africa's deep appreciation for increasingly deepening the partnership and the collaboration that we have in pursuit of a collective agenda, the promotion of peace and security, international peace and security at that, on the African continent. I also wish to recognize and thank Ambassador Fred for his presence and sharing his thoughts. The new agenda for peace provides a foundation for thinking about the kind of a multilateral arrangement that is fit for purpose for the time that we live in. It provides us a basis for thinking about what kind of proposals what kind of ideas we need to take forward as members of the United Nations negotiate on the outcome of the Summit of the Future, which is scheduled, as Nicholas mentioned earlier on, as well as Gerald, in September 2024. I think the starting point, the point of departure, is a recognition that the multilateral system is in crisis. You may recall during the debate on in the Security Council with respect to the invasion of Russia on Ukraine, Kenya's permanent representative to the UN, then member of the elected members of the Security Council, made a very sobering point that the multilateral system was on its deathbed. That was the point that was made. I think one of the questions that is important for us to ask is whether the multilateral system being on its deathbed is a result only of that clear violation of the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter in respect to Ukraine. And I think this is extremely important because unless we have a full and comprehensive consideration of what led us to this point of multilateralism coming to this deep crisis, also as recognized in the Agenda for Peace, we wouldn't be able to basically fully respond to the nature of this crisis that multilateralism is facing. In that sense, therefore, we have to ask whether that particular grave moment is basically one in a series of events, that it is a symptom of the problem rather than an embodiment of the problem itself, and therefore requires us to reckon with the place where, as we say in Africa, where the rain started to beat us, so to speak. And Ambassador Fried, in that sense, and indeed the Secretary General himself in the Agenda for Peace, makes reference to this point, that is the perception about double standard and selective application of international norms. It's not just selective application of international norms that has created a crisis. It is also actually how breaches of international law are engaged and censored and reprimanded by the international community. Whether we have experienced an even, equal reprimanding of all breaches of international law. Whether we have actually, done that, I think that is a very important consideration. So part of the point that the new Agenda for Peace makes is, how do we now make sure that we have trust in the multilateral system restored? Because that is part one of the central principles that the new Agenda for Peace identifies. Restoring trust in the multilateral system. That restoration of trust requires addressing this fundamental point. So there are a number of points in that respect. The whole question of ensuring that the voices of different parts of the world are given space to be heard and to inform decision-making in global decision-making structures and processes. From that perspective, therefore, one can't emphasize enough the importance of the UN-AU partnership. And this is crucial for a number of reasons. First, in a time of deep contestation between global powers and geopolitical rivalry deepening, regional organizations such as the African Union may provide us the basis for building common ground between these deeply contesting powers of the world. I think that is a huge opportunity that needs to be seized with. And the new agenda for peace actually hints at exactly this point. Because part of what needs to happen in a time of multipolarity, where trust between different global powers is very low, is to facilitate an environment where common ground would be found in order to respond to the very pressing challenge that the world faces. Challenge that couldn't, to use the words of the new agenda for peace, not even the most powerful country in the world can by itself deal with. Which means that these challenges are challenges for the whole of humanity, such as, for example, climate, as have been mentioned also by Gerald, and in the new agenda for peace, which requires pooling all the efforts and the capacities that one can bring to bear. The UN Charter, indeed, under Chapter 8, envisaged the role and the contribution of regional organizations. But we can ask a question. Did the drafters of the UN Charter imagine that there would come a time like this one when the UN would be overstretched in the way the UN is overstretched today? Thereby, the UN would find itself in a very difficult moment where it couldn't really bear the responsibility entrusted to itself in the first place, right? I doubt it if they have imagined a moment like that one. All right. So this moment, therefore, is a moment that actually requires the role and relationship between regional organizations and the UN to go even much bigger, much deeper than what was taught when Chapter 8 was crafted, Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. What that means is basically regional organizations and their role in the promotion of international peace and security needs to be recognized in a much more systematic way. It has to be considered and established to be part and parcel of the global collective security architecture. That it has to be part of the global toolbox for the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict, anchored on the UN Charter. So the Secretary General already also hints at this, not just in the new agenda for peace, but previously in the report that he submitted to the UN Security Council with respect to the financing, all right, that was presented to the UN Security Council in May, where he clearly sees it is only when we consider, because the arrangement, yes, between the partnership has been, really significant in terms of its evolution, but it's difficult to say that, this arrangement is considered as being fully systematic, as being established to be part and parcel of the global toolbox for the promotion of international peace and security. I think that is what is so important that we need to think about, and therefore push the envelope, so to speak, based on what is already articulated in the new agenda for peace. The importance of this is that we, as Amani Africa, when we briefed the UN Security Council, we said that the discussion about financing is not about money. The discussion about financing is not about money. The discussion about financing, first and foremost, is about the kind of arrangement that needs to be put in place between the UN and the African Union in pursuit of the primary purpose of the United Nations, which is the promotion of international peace and security. What kind of arrangement should be in place between the two in order to ensure that international peace and security in Africa is secured? It is about that. The financing is basically very much secondary. That is why, for example, I welcome, and indeed we have articulated that in various of our reports, including on the New Agenda for Peace, where we clearly set out, suggesting that we have to imagine this partnership between the AU and the UN beyond what it has been so far. It requires a higher level of collaboration and coordination, a higher level of joint analysis and assessment, a higher level of, therefore, political engagement than what we have had so far. And therefore, in the framework, resolution, the expectation about the kind of closer working relationship, the kind of at the political level is very, very, very important. I think then you go from there to the other areas. How do we strengthen, one of the questions is how do we strengthen multilateralism? That is at the core of it. Part of it is about what we call trust. And that trust can be built through the instrumentality also of the role of regional organizations such as the African Union, in them strategically taking advantage of their position in building bridges between different contending global powers. That is one. The other one is in them also using their voice to promote the other principle enshrined in the New Agenda for Peace, which is universality. Universality at its core is about responding to the charge against the multilateral system, about selective application, about double standards. Universalism is at its core about that. That is why, for example, it is extremely important as we speak today. We have to ask ourselves whether we are giving the attention that the crisis in Sudan is deserving. This is one of the worst conflicts that we have, not just on the continent, but also one can say globally. But look at the level of attention that we are giving to other spheres of crisis. Indeed, they deserve that level of attention. But why don't we give equal level of attention, or at least, set the level of attention that the Sudan crisis requires? Because at the end of the day, what that raises is the question of, do we value the life of a Sudanese in the same way that we value the lives that are being lost and being tormented in different war zones, Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, without us really affirming this fundamental value of universality, and therefore recognizing the life of everybody in different conflict settings as worthy of equal concern and protection? It is difficult to regain faith in the multilateral system, particularly for those parts of the world that have failed historically as being marginalized, as being on the receiving end of things. So I think from a perspective of strengthening multilateralism, I think the point about diplomacy can't be emphasized enough. That point speaks to the question that Fred raised about sovereignty, about the AU not being provided space to do the work that it used to do. All right? Now we have to ask difficult question. That is me. Now, being an analyst, that is what I, right? So I asked Fred, why do member states invoke sovereignty? One of the points, a very profound point that the new Agenda for Peace makes is this one. The UN has to be the hub where international issues are debated and discussed, and the possibility for resolution of those issues is sought. And the Secretary General is very clear. In order to do that, he clearly says that we have to earn the trust of the membership of the UN as a whole. So perhaps is it because member states have lost trust in the AU that they say, if I give this file to the AU, then we run into difficulty of basically this matter being internationalized, being, handled badly, and therefore it's better that we say, don't come in. Could that be an issue? Right? Should we also ask question, how is the AU handling peace and security issues on the continent? Let's take the example of Sudan. Can we say the AU is really doing what it is supposed to do? When is the last time the AU even considered to issue a statement about the mass atrocities that are happening in Darfur, specifically? Darfur, that was the first agenda item in the Peace and Security Council when it first started. Darfur, that was the site of many of the incredible tools that have been elaborated and developed by the African Union. When did we say anything about that? How are we handling the file on Sudan? Can we say that it has been credible? It has been trustworthy? If we can't, then we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we need to fix about how we go about doing things? Because it is what we do as actors that give life to the norms of Article 4H, which mandates the AU to intervene in member states in cases of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And we have been in a time when these things have become so common, so routine. Not just in Sudan. We have seen it happening here. And where is the outrage? So there is something that really, needs to be done in order to restore faith and trust in multilateralism, both continentally, but also globally. And that starts with the one fundamental issue that we need to do. I will just quote that from our report and then end. In a world where impunity for mass killing runs rampant, in a world where violent wars are waged with no regard to the fundamental tenets of the UN Charter, where meddling outside powers too often obstruct diplomacy, as is happening in Sudan, there is nothing more imperative than a peace and security agenda that focuses on averting harm or minimizing the evil of violent conflicts. I think we need to go back to that very fundamental point, that our role, first and foremost, at the AU, at the UN, is to mitigate, to minimize suffering by those civilians who are caught up in the crossfire of violence. It is when we hold the foundation that we can build from there. If we don't have the foundation, how can we imagine to build even better and bigger? Thank you very much, Nicholas.
No, thank you, Solomon. That was a very rich presentation, and you've highlighted quite a number of very important points. The first of which I think is the question that you asked, the point of departure. What led us here? And the point that you make that unless we answer this question, then our efforts towards designing or redesigning a fairer, more equitable, more fit for purpose multilateral system of which the global collective security system is a part of, will come to naught. So we need to focus on that question, and even within the UN-AU partnership, focusing on that question as a way to advocate and to engage in this discussion leading up to the Summit of the Future. You also raised an important point about this being a critical moment, and that perhaps the framers of the Charter may not have fully understood the extent to which Chapter 8 would be of importance and relevance, particularly in the context that we're facing now, where clearly the peace and security challenges that we're facing have overwhelmed any single organization to resolve them, whether it's the African Union, whether it's REX, or whether it's the UN, or even if it's other ad hoc mechanisms. So the question, and of course, the Charter was written, it was adopted long before the OAU or the AU came into existence. So the question is also, and specifically in reaction or in relation to the AU-UN partnership, the question is, how do we ensure that this partnership and the collaboration between the AU and the UN lives up to the expectations and fulfills the expectations and the needs and demands placed on the partnership in addressing peace and security? I think these are very important points. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to open the floor, but I would just like to, before we open the floor, we'll start with the questions from those who are participating in person here at the Hayat. And then maybe the second round will be for people who are participating virtually. But before we do that, I would just like to perhaps invite the panel members, Gerald, Fred, maybe to reflect on one of the points that that Solomon made, was the imperative, the need for a higher level of engagement, a higher level of collaboration, a higher level of cooperation between the AU and the UN in light of the challenges that we're facing currently, globally, and also in light of what has been recognized in the new agenda for peace. There is currently quite, and even in my time here in Addis, there's been significant developments at the level of cooperation between the UN Secretariat and the African Union Commission, as well as between the two councils, between the UN Security Council and the AUPSC. Obviously, like anything else, there's room for growth, but there has been significant improvement and significant developments. But I would just like perhaps if we can start with Gerald and Fred, just to reflect on that collaboration between the Commission and the UN Secretariat, as well as between the two councils, and you could even add to that the Peace Building Commission. If you could just reflect on that and perhaps reflect on the developments that have taken place over the years, and perhaps also some of the areas for growth in that particular sphere. Maybe we start with Fred and then Gerald.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. You know, I was privileged to, as you know, I think with you, we're privileged to negotiate on the framework, you know, on peace and security. I think it was April 2017. And since then, we had now the framework on, you know, between Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063, and more recently, the framework on human rights cooperation. So I think that overall, our collaboration with the UN has been quite good, and I would even say very strong under the chairperson, Moussa Faki, and the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. But at the end of the day, what people want to see is action. In fact, someone was telling me that we pat ourselves too much on the back, but people want to see action. And so we need to, I think, also, you know, talk about the good things that we have done, but also show more action on the ground. And here I would like to take this opportunity to thank also some of the partners who have been supporting this partnership. Here I'm thinking about Norway. I can see Sina is in the room, and how they have quite strongly supported our partnership. And I would like to appeal to others as well to also support us in strengthening this partnership. But in the end of the day, I think that if we are seeking, I think we have, in terms of our engagement, we have the desk-to-desk, we have the joint task force, and we have the annual conference. Engagements are there, but if we really, really want to make a difference, I think that we need to look into the Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council, into the way they work, and their ability to deliver conflict prevention, and their ability to deliver also you know, conflict resolution. If you look at the crisis, I think Solomon was mentioning the crisis in Sudan. What has stopped us, both the AU, the UN, and I would say even IGAD, what has stopped us, prevented us from securing a ceasefire? If we reflect really, a ceasefire, when you look at all the tools at our disposition, why haven't we secured a ceasefire until to this day? When you talk about the atrocities in Darfur, in fact, this morning I was being asked, you know, what do you need monitoring mechanism? Do you need to actually call it out and say what's happening? What is preventing us from doing that? So I think that at the end of the day, we, as the UN Secretariat and the EU Commission, we're just secretariats. The UN and the AU are its member states, are its Peace and Security Council. And I think that some effort needs to be applied there. Over to you.
Thank you, Fred. You're right. The AU Commission, UN Secretariat, we're not policy-making, we're not decision-making bodies, we're secretariats that support the decision-making organs. But having said that, have we, even at the Secretariat and Commission level, done the full extent of what we can do to support the councils in making the decisions that they need to make? I think that's a question that we need to reflect on. I know, Fred, you previously, in your previous capacity, you did a lot of work on early warning and conflict prevention. And perhaps this is one area that we can strengthen our collaboration at the Commission Secretariat level, and ask ourselves: Are we necessarily feeding the councils with the kind of information, with the early warning, with the advice that they need to make informed decisions on conflict situations? I'll give Gerald the floor just to answer the question, and then we'll open the floor to those in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. I think when sort of looking at the issue of taking the partnership to a next level, I think we do have to stop and pause and look at what we have achieved in terms of the institutionalization of the partnership. Yes, the personal chemistry between our principals is a good one, and sort of their initiative has helped to forge this more structured partnership. But it has evolved into something which is an institutional partnership, which is does permit for interaction at many levels through the statutory meetings that have been mentioned of the two organizations. The framework agreement that we have, the framework agreement on development, which is being further deepened and rationalized even in the last few weeks and months. The new framework on human rights. So there is this, there is quite a comprehensive, a multi-dimensional approach to the partnership. We have seen just in the last months the UN Security Council and AU Peace and Security Council meeting here in Addis reaching a final communique, which states again certain commitments. We saw the Peace Building Commission and the AUPSC also reaching a joint communique. I think we have to look carefully at how the commitments expressed and the joint vision expressed in those communiques are followed up on. And I think that's why we were quite pleased to also see a commitment to expert level interaction and to more of that, which also perhaps can help to position the councils in an informed manner to maximize their engagements when they meet, and to sort of help to ensure that the council to council dimension is also a more and more dynamic part of the partnership. As I think everyone knows, the framework agreement on peace and security really regulates the partnership between the Secretariat and the AU Commission, but the growing interaction between the councils is an important development, will be important in helping to take the partnership to a next level. And I could perhaps just briefly mention in that context, over the last couple of years, an important development whereby our office and the AUPSC Secretariat, we facilitate a meeting normally at the end of each month, leading into the next month, for the incoming president of the Security Council, incoming chair of the AUPSC, to try and set out their respective programs of work, to share what they expect to be their sort of key points on the respective programs of work. But it has occasionally permitted the ability to sort of where issues are coming up on both agendas for the AU position to be fed into the Security Council discussions. And again, that really comes down to a matter of communication and understanding sort of the chronology of synchronicity of issues under discussion. But again, just to say, I think there is a solid foundation to allow the partnership to progress to a higher level, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. But we also have to recognize the need to really be perseverant in trying to get the partnership to the next level.
Yeah, and certainly I think the demands that we're facing and the vision of the Secretary General, as elaborated in the new Agenda for Peace, will call for us to strengthen and enhance that collaboration and take it to a much higher level than it is currently. Okay, so we'll open the floor. We'll take perhaps the first round of 3 questions. The gentleman in the green shirt, You'll go first, and then Yusuf next, and then the gentleman at the back will be the third. We'll take the first round and then have the panel answer their questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the presentations. My name is Joel Lahlberg, Embassy of Sweden. And my question had to do with the human rights framework that has been referred to in the presentations, and the accountability issue that the AU has lifted to as a priority area, one of the 6 priority areas. And yet, as Solomon has pointed out, in many of the communiques of African Union and IGAD, the issue of accountability is missing. You mentioned the Darfur crisis and the atrocities that's been going on there. And whereas UN seemed to stress much more the issue of accountability in the Human Rights Council, in monitoring missions, etc., etc. So I'd just like to hear from the panelists a bit more on how you would explain this gap on accountability between the UN and the African institutions, AU and IGAD. And if you accepted it's a gap, how would you go about mending it? What are your suggestions? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, please thank you. Thank you for the panelists for the presentations and comments. So this is Youssef Belal from the UN Office of the Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa. And I think both at the UN and at the African Union, we're all in the business of peace through the building of institutions. And building of institutions, both transnational institutions, which is the very idea of UN or the African Union, but also national institutions. And the question here is both for the UN and the African Union, which is there is a space, a sphere of issues for which, because of their transnational nature, within an international system that is still based on nation states, that are, because let's say migration, let's say climate change, let's say a number of issues, because of their nature, require cooperation between those member states. But the question, and given the nature of most conflicts in Africa and beyond, is that those conflicts are internal conflicts. And here comes the question, what is the legitimate space of intervention when you have those internal conflicts? And I think this question is still open-ended and has never been fully addressed. You can look at the AU Charter, you can look at the UN Charter, you look at the number of, but it is still something that is done on a case-by-case basis. The limit between the two of what is considered legitimate or not still needs to be, I think, clarified. And which brings me to my other question and comment, or comment question, which is, when we look at the nature of international systems that you have all described in this current crisis, and no one will contest that. And when we think about the summit of the future and what could be done practically, is that it seems that the response that we're thinking of through, for example, the summit for the future, is that it is by bringing the question of legitimacy that we will address the question of effectiveness. And what I mean is that, which is basically the experience of the African Union and the concept or the idea of African solutions for African problems when it is properly explained and understood, which is that you need a certain degree of legitimacy for precisely a form of supranational and institutional intervention that is coming from outside the country. And by the very fact of having a more legitimate institution, then the response would be more effective, would be able to bring a cessation of hostilities, a peace agreement. So I think the thinking is still behind that, because today, when we're talking about the crisis of international system, there is a crisis of effectiveness, the inability of those global and regional institutions to address the conflicts. There is a crisis also related to an issue of coherence by the very actors that have been shaping those global institutions in their behavior, which has been said in the when we spoke about the selective implementation of international laws. There is a major issue of coherence within the Security Council, which makes it dysfunctional today. So then the question would be, is legitimacy really the answer? More representation at the global level of African countries, of the African Union, would really bring more effectiveness in a situation where those institutions are unable to respond. And my last point, I'll be very quick, last comment, and it is the question of how we think about political transitions. Because today, in a global order where those norms and institutions have been shaped by Euro-America, Western democracies, and so on, with the emergence of China, there is a different understanding of what it means to intervene politically. And the emergence of China raises a question from that perspective, is the relationship between the internal system and the external order. And here is the question whether, for example, the concept of a viable state, which is different than democratic state, viable for the state itself to sustain itself, and viable for the people that are ruled under that state. So the question is also, how do we think politically and how we address, through the conceptual tools that we have, the conflicts in Africa and beyond, and whether we need to think also beyond the usual categories that we are used to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman at the back.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to reflect my concerns and questions. First of all, I appreciate Amani Africa and his partners for hosting this an amazing dialogue where we can participate, also share concepts. And the other one that I want to reflect is just, it's really interesting. Sorry, I just forget to introduce myself. This is Bru Cascialo. I'm a founder and president of Ndaras Youth Association, a local international youth-led organization which have more than 400 members and volunteers across Ethiopia and the globe. One of our thematic areas is working on young emerging diplomats and leaders, so that the right representation of our country history, heritage will be takes place in the world stage. So I found the topic very interesting, since we are talking about peace and security. There is a so-called path that scientists and many others, philosophers agree that peace and security and other self-dignity comes after getting food, getting basic needs and other stuff. And for Africans, this issue must be discussed and raised in the world stage, because the relationship that we have with the world system, with UN and other international organizations, is just about giving aid, financing projects, water projects, other basic needs. But since we are a global citizen and a member of the international community, peace and security also must be raised and discussed in a high level in a kind of manner like this. I also appreciate what Dr. Solomon has been saying, that there must be, we must have restored the trust that the multilateral relationship that takes place since the world globalization and also international organization, we were losing the trust that we have within the organization in a multilateral relationship. But one way to recur is just having such kind of policy dialogues and programs that can the public can engage, also discuss. So when I come to my question is, I want to ask 2 points, how you measure the inclusiveness, also the integrity of the new peace agenda, also the policy that you are planning to implement with United Nations and African Union, because one of the things that we don't see visible in Africa Union, also in other international organizations, is lack of integrity. The individuals, the leaders are not integrated with the idea and the actions that they take. Also the policy and the implementation of the policy across the country, also the organization. So how far you are determined to measure the integrity that the policy will take place, especially since I come from the youth-led association. Without the youth involvement and advocacy, I don't think that this will be a reality, because when you see the majority of loss in a peace and conflicts, I'm going to wrap up in a minute. The main actor here is just the youth, because they don't get the chance to advocate about peace, security, international issues within this organization. So how this policy and new agenda of peace is being inclusive and also integrated. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've had the first 3 questions. I'll hand over to the panel in reverse order. So we'll start with Dr. Solomon, and then Fred, and then Gerald. And for Fred and Solomon, if you could reflect on the first question on the human rights framework, the accountability framework within that. How do you explain the gap, if there is a gap at all? And if you can also, the 2 of you, if you can also reflect on the second series of questions from Yusuf, on the legitimate space for intervention, whether it's case by case or not. Does Article 4H of the Constitutive Act pronounce the AU position on that, and how is it applied? And the legitimacy of supranationality, which he also outlined, in order to make responses more effective, and also the point about transitions, viable states and so on. And then the third question, maybe Fred and Gerald, you can reflect on this one. And it's a point that was actually raised at the inaugural retreat of the AU and UN special representatives that took place in Cairo in October. The fact that the collaboration, the partnership between the two organizations needs to be it needs to have greater grounding amongst the population across the continent, and it needs to be in a way, in one way or another, needs to be domesticated to ensure that it is actually owned by the populations across the continent. So if you could also reflect on that question, Gerald and Fred, but start with Solomon.
Thank you, Nicholas, and I would like to thank the participants for the great questions that they have posed and their reflections. On the accountability question, I think at a normative level, I don't think that, really there is much issue. Normatively speaking, Nicholas just made reference to Article 4H of the Constitutive Act, which commits the African Union to what we call the principle of non-indifference, that the Union wouldn't be indifferent to the suffering and plight of civilians who are caught up in the crossfire of war and guns. That is the commitment that have been made by the African Union. Its member states, the African Union Commission, are the, if you like, the locomotive for action, right? So I think, you know, there's something that is fundamentally important. I think where we are today, that gap comes from the norm to implementation crisis that we have. And today we ask a question. I think it's not just today, but I think one can say over the course of the past maybe 5 or so years, it has become more pronounced. And that question has to do with whether the politics of indifference that was characteristic of the Organization of African Unity is creeping back in the way the AU and regional organizations operate. Whether we are also experiencing a more statist, state-centric ways of thinking and going about doing these activities and works relating to the promotion of peace and security, but also with respect to accountability. There is also the other dimension, I think, which has to do with the accusation that these accountability mechanisms are used for pursuing what may be considered to be extra, you know, maybe issues that are not really about, you know, more primarily about those issues of protection, those issues of holding perpetrators to account, right? So it requires, I think, being cognizant of all these different dynamics, right? So that's why, for example, it is very problematic in the current setting to oppose, for example, the proposal in the UN Human Rights Council for the establishment of an international mechanism for investigating what is unfolding in Sudan. I find it extremely difficult to understand why African countries would oppose that. I would have imagined African countries to occupy the space where these debates are happening and inform and shape and, you know, enable those accountability mechanisms. If they have suspicion and doubt about those accountability mechanisms being instrumentalized politically, they can craft ways of shielding those mechanisms from being instrumentalized. All right. But not to support those mechanisms, I think it's difficult to understand that. More so because we are not establishing here on the continent those kinds of mechanisms that can investigate, monitor, report on these atrocious acts that are being committed with no regard or concern for any consequence by the warring factions in Sudan, for example. So I think it's a very serious issue of concern that, you know, as the African Union need to seriously contend with and address. I think there was a moment in which the institutions of the AU were viewed as processes of expressing solidarity, as enterprises of solidarity. And therefore, there was a much more trust in those institutions. I'm not really sure about that today, right? So we need to, I think, go back. And the other thing is, of course, the leadership crisis that we have on the continent. I think this crisis, of course, is not unique to the continent. I think it's a global phenomenon. We can see that, playing itself out today in the negotiations on climate change. But that crisis of leadership also plays a very significant role. And this crisis of leadership is not just on the part of member states, it applies to regional organizations at the level of the AU, but also sub-regional organizations as well. The kind of question that Nicholas asked, are we providing the decision makers with the kind of credible, trusted, solid analysis, technical input that help them get the work done? I mean, this is a very fundamental question. I mean, in terms of leadership, or at the level of the Commission, at the level of the Secretariat. That is what, and indeed, the New Agenda for Peace touched on these issues as well. The importance of really gaining trust, and the confidence of all. And that impartiality, professionalism, integrity is important in that respect. So it is, I think, a multi-faceted, I mean, the factors are multifaceted that explain why we are having the kind of situation that we have in terms of the gap between an impressive normative commitment, but as Ambassador Fred said, what people really ask for is action, okay, in terms of the nature of the action that is taken. I think, there is no formula, Yusuf, in terms of how to go about mobilizing intervention with respect to responding to a particular crisis or conflict situation as such. But one thing that we know from experience, building on also the norms, is that I think diplomacy is extremely, extremely important. And one of the items in the New Agenda for Peace, more than any other, that I really take, I mean, this is an old thing, it's not a new thing, right? But I don't think that diplomacy today is where it is supposed to be. This is the time when we need a very refined, very nuanced, and extremely robust diplomacy. I don't know if we do have that. That is why it is extremely important for institutions. For example, here we talk about, for example, Sudan again. I'm sorry, I have to come back again and again to that, because this is a live issue that we are all experiencing. Nicholas earlier on mentioned our role is to advise them. Our role is to facilitate the implementation of the decision that they have taken. Well, the Peace and Security Council have taken a decision for the establishment of a high-level panel that would provide a dedicated framework for engagement, for mobilizing diplomacy, diplomatic action with respect to the situation in Sudan. Would the AU Commission act on it? That is really the question, right? Because that is a question of credibility again. On the legitimacy question, would legitimacy be the only? I don't think legitimacy is important, absolutely important. But is it enough? I don't think that it's enough. I don't think that legitimacy by itself would fix the question of effectiveness. You may have very legitimate spaces for decision making. If those engaging in decision making do not demonstrate commitment, political commitment, for cooperating, and through that cooperation to shoulder, and take the kind of action situations warrant and require, then, even if all the different voices are represented in that space, action may not necessarily come forth. So I doubt that legitimacy by itself alone would address the question of effectiveness. It goes beyond and above legitimacy, the kind of situation that we face. On viable states and whether we need to go beyond the existing conceptual tools, I don't think so. Here is the reason why I don't think so. I think the question of viable states, multilateralism is premised on the existence of states who are capable to cooperate, who are capable to shoulder responsibilities. If you think about any human rights instrument, for example, ask yourself, what kind of state is this human rights instrument imagining? It is imagining a very robust, viable, capable state. Because without that, it would be difficult to imagine the possibility of fulfilling those rights enshrined in those human rights instruments. That's why I say I doubt if we really need, a new way of thinking, all right? The perspectives and the angles, the philosophical underpinning of what we mean by, strong states may vary. But when it comes to whether we have those expectations from different perspectives, I think I would say, yes, we do have that expectation. And today, part of the challenge really is whether, I think some of these issues are also canvassed in the New Agenda for Peace, whether we actually are able to provide the kind of a space, policy space at that would enable the enhancement and expansion of states. Fred mentioned earlier on, we didn't inherit the states. I don't know if it is a question of inheriting, but at least the states that came into existence are states in the legal sense, not necessarily in the functional sense. And what would make these states functional is basically the existence of, the capabilities. And that requires states to be in control of, for example, their economies, in control of their resources. Are African states in control of their resources, for example? The market price of the resources is not set in Africa, it's set elsewhere. And you are dictated by that. How do you build a capable state under those conditions?
Thank you very much, Solomon. Fred, Ambassador Fred, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. I'll be brief. I think that, first of all, on the accountability, it's not only an African problem, it's a worldwide problem. And I think that we need to look into the mechanism that we have in place. Why have they not worked? Why, like, for example, the International Criminal Court, which in principle is a good thing, but why is it that many countries are not adhering to it? It's because of the selectivity in terms of applying some of these things that we have a problem with. But that is not an excuse enough. I think that the reality is that when you look at, like Solomon was saying, the norms, which were very ambitious, and you look at the implementation, I think that at some point we need a sort of rupture, in terms of the way we do things. The reason why most of the time accountability is not mentioned is because of the fear that they will no longer have. It's a question of access to the belligerents. For example, if you raise the issue of atrocities that we're talking about, how are you going to then bring on the table some of the parties that are committing those atrocities? Here we're talking about Darfur. The RSF is accused. So how do you engage them after you have accused them of committing these things? So I think that that's where the debate is really. There's this need for access and the need to speak truth to power about what is happening. And by the way, mind you, in the Rwandan genocide of 1994 against the Tutsis, that's exactly what happened, why the UN was not intervening, because in their mind, they thought, oh, we need to engage the belligerents who are committing atrocities. So so this is something that, in my view, that we need to revisit. On the issue of legitimacy, I think I also agree with Solomon. Legitimacy is not enough. At the end of the day, what people care about is our ability to deliver for them the most basic human needs: security, food, education, and healthcare. Those most basic things, actually, we need to deliver on that. So I think, until we're able to do that, will continue to become irrelevant. I would like to put actually a question to you all. There is this debate that we've been having with some of my colleagues in terms of multilateralism and how it can be efficient. Should we be service delivery oriented? Because at the end of the day, there is a famous song of Janet Jackson, "What have you done for me lately?" And member states tend to ask, what have you done for us? And so we have not been relevant for them. So therefore, I'm just putting it up to you all. Should we be more service delivery oriented? Over to you.
What have you done for me lately? Who wants to take that on?
Thanks, Nicholas. Perhaps I'll also respond to some of the questions that were raised, and then we can come back to Fred's overarching question. But with reference to the human rights dimension, and it, I think, sort of the question derived from the discussion around the new UN-AU human rights framework. That framework did take some time to achieve. It was thought through quite carefully in terms of what could be committed to and what could not be committed to. And on balance, the framework is quite a significant commitment in the human rights context. In terms of accountability and how that framework may serve as a catalyst in terms of accountability in the human rights dimension, I mean, that will depend going forwards, again, how this framework agreement is implemented in practice. But obviously accountability requires transparency, and transparency then hopefully builds public confidence. I could say that in this context, as UN-AU, we work very closely with the AUC on compliance framework issues related to human rights in the context of peace support operations and policy frameworks, and we will continue to do so. But perhaps it's also a multi sort of level issue. It's obviously at a multilateral level and intergovernmental level, and responsibilities that have to be taken in that regard. But we've also talked about national governance deficits, institutional deficits at the national level, and issues of accountability at member state level. So I think that issue really has to be addressed with a multi-level approach. With regards to the state of peace and security, and with regards to internal conflicts, and the need to have a holistic approach, that sort of development and governance deficits are two sides of the same coin. And in that context, the important role that the AU plays in terms of standing up for normative frameworks. We talked a little bit about the tensions between the principles of non-indifference versus sovereignty. But in the end, sovereignty, of course, is a fundamental issue. At the same time, as a community of states, the principle of non-indifference is an important issue. But for example, where you've seen unconstitutional change of government with military assuming power, are they really doing better? Are they really winning the arguments? I think that they're falling short. And in terms of the legitimacy of supranationality, again, in the complex world that we live in today, is the trade-off, the trade-off between some limits on national power in favor of a supranational approach. It has to be considered on a case-by-case, nation-by-nation approach. But I think we do see the benefits in the end, even though it's been a difficult time for multilateralism. In the end, I think we do see the benefits of a multilateral approach. In terms of the role that the AU can play in terms of its legitimacy as its convening power, I mean, I think we do see this evidence of this all of the time. I think what we haven't touched upon perhaps too much is sort of the process that the AU is going through in terms of its own internal reforms, and in that sense, the rationalization of the role of the African Union versus regional economic communities and division of labor, and in the end, of course, if that arrives, as that process evolves and arrives at a sort of in a more allowing both AU and the RECs to play their roles more effectively, that in turn builds legitimacy and public confidence. On the last question, in terms of the new agenda for peace, it's important to bear in mind this is still a vision, it's still a policy proposal. It comes in at an important time in the lead up to the Summit of the Future. It was consulted again very thoroughly. We alluded to the discussions that took place with the African Union. That wasn't in isolation. There were a number of parallel discussions, and the colleagues at UN headquarters had extensive discussions with regional and sub-regional organizations and beyond, and civil society organizations in helping to develop and evolve the new agenda for peace, which ultimately the Secretary General has taken full ownership of and has put forth as his vision. And there were great attempts to undertake that process in an inclusive manner, so that really multiple voices were heard. And again, it will be interesting now to see how that vision encompassed in the document is taken forward, and again, what is the global response? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald. We are now at 5 minutes to 4. I'm told that we can possibly take another 15 to 20 minutes, hoping that those who are here with us and online have that flexibility as well. But in the spirit of inclusivity and ensuring that the virtual participants also participate in the discussion, I'll hand over to Sion to read some of the questions that we received from them. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nicholas. So yeah, we've only received about a couple of questions, so it won't take that long. The first one relates to, how UN and AU can collaborate around the area of preventive action. I think our panelists have already touched on that issue, within the parameters of how the new agenda for peace emphasizes the importance of preventive diplomacy and also mediation. So the question is really if our panelists could simply just emphasize some of the concrete ways or solid ways through which, AU and UN could ensure timely and effective preventive actions are taken to avert escalation of tensions within the region. Another interesting question is around, I mean, we've said quite a bit around how member states really hold the key to ensure collaborations do make multilateralism effective. So this question is actually interesting in that it's asking what ways could we suggest through which member states can actually contribute to or support UN and AU around having a more meaningful sort of partnership. So these are the couple of questions we have, if there are more.
Okay, thank you very much. Fred, I would like to hear your views on the first question on preventive action, concrete ways, given your vast experience in conflict prevention, early warning. If you could just share some thoughts on some concrete areas in which the United Nations and the AU can work productively in order to make our responses more effective in those areas. Fred, over to you.
Thanks, Nicholas. I think the first point that I would like to make here is that we need to go back to the basics in terms of how we do diplomacy. I know of at least 5 or 6 situations on the continent where we know as we speak that we're going to have a crisis, but we're not taking action in terms of dealing with it. Some of it has to do with the member states invoking sovereignty. But even around that, there are certain things that we can do, and it has to do, and you have to factor in what we call time, the timing of it. For example, a member state will be reluctant to engage you once they are part of breaking news on BBC or CNN or Al Jazeera. However, if you know that this member state is vulnerable, and that you focus your action on structure, on tackling the structural vulnerabilities of a particular state, I think that you will have a better chance to engage and to have a conversation and to do preventive diplomacy. So we need to factor it. We need to take action. We need to. The timing is quite important. The third, tackling structural issues ahead of time is better than being reactive when you have a conflict. The other thing that we must do is actually really bridging the gap between early warning and early response. I know it's a broken record, but the reality is that in my experience, there is not a single crisis situation actually that we have not seen coming, not a single one. But for some reason, we have not been able to get action going, or actually to get the PSC to give us guidance in terms of what needs to be done. And here, which brings me to my other point, and you had asked about it earlier, Nicholas. Do we give enough information to our PSC member states for them to be able to make informed decisions about a particular crisis, or for them to have enough time to go back to their capitals to secure guidance on how to act on a particular issue? Here, I see the AU and the UN. I think if there's one thing that we can do well is to provide good analysis and good recommendations to our member states so that they're able to make informed decisions. I like a lot what Amani does. Solomon, there is not a single ambassador of the APSC that Solomon doesn't know, and his Amani team. What they do is that they engage them on issues. And I think that we need to borrow a leaf from what Amani does and engage our member states a bit more. I would like to challenge you, Nicholas, and those in the audience. If you look at the time that we spend at work and in our engagement, in our work and delivering and meetings and so on and so forth, how much versus the time that we spend going into the embassies of our member states and engaging them about a given issue, you will find actually that we spend little time engaging our member states. We are caught up in different meetings and different things, but our engagement with our member states, I think this is something that we should be doing jointly. And the more that we do that, I think the more we may have actually better results in terms of the decision making of our member states and the building of trust that people mentioned before. So let's focus on ensuring that we take action for those situations that we know that we're going to have problems. Let's make sure that we factor in time let's make sure that we bridge the gap between early warning and early response. Let's tackle structural issues, and let's enhance our ability to engage our member states so that they make better informed decisions. I'll give you an example. One PSC member state actually, we're discussing today. A lot of talk has happened on Sudan, and we were engaged with on the case of Sudan. And one PSC member state thought that the conflict in Sudan was only about the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces which are fighting, but it's much more complex. There is a Darfur crisis which has been going on for a long time, and he said, look, I will need more information so that we can make better informed decisions about what's happening. So this issue of engaging more member states, I think, is where we need to put more emphasis on, and providing them as much information as possible about what is it that we know and what we factually know without being biased. I would like to finish with one last point. I think our member states also need to have an open mind. They need to have an open mind and not always think that we have an agenda that we are advancing. This has the idea that we have an agenda that we are, or someone else's agenda, has actually created a level of mistrust between us and our member states, and they need to be open, because in light of the multiple crises that we're having, we need to understand how it affects Africa. For example, let me conclude by telling you, you look at the crisis in Ukraine, its impact on Africa. Not many actually understood until they felt the impact on Africa. What is happening in the Middle East today? What is its impact on Africa? We should be providing those analyses to our member states so that they can make informed decisions. I saw today an article by ISS, and I'm glad that they have put it out there. But we took too long, and these are some of the things that we should be doing. Over to you.
Fred, thank you very much. Those were very concrete and very concrete points. So thank you for sharing those. But I'd just like you to reflect also on one other issue. The collaboration between the AU and REX, specifically in the area of conflict prevention and early warning, because I think there's much that can happen in that space to strengthen responses, to strengthen early warning and advice that is provided to the PSC, provided to the REX member states as well, in order to either mitigate or to address emerging threats to peace and security before they flare up into full-blown conflict. I know this is an area that you had also previously been working on, so maybe you can share some thoughts on that as well. And then also the question about how member states can better support the AU partnership. I would also like you to reflect on that question as well, and also Gerald. So back to you, Fred.
With the REX, of course, we have the principle of subsidiarity, and we have established a very sophisticated and robust early warning mechanism, which actually starts from the REX and escalates all the way up. And we often actually meet to exchange notes in terms of what needs to be done. So I think that, again, but we need a political decision in terms of how to intervene in a given country and to respond. Let me give you just an example. We have, for example, in the ECOWAS region, about 18 border disputes. We know about them, but are member states ready to engage on how to sort it out? That's because now it goes to the political level. Like you said, we're not decision makers, but we can advise. The other thing which I think is important is how to we participate a lot in the REX meetings, and they also contribute a lot to the PSC session. But what happens when there are divergence of views? And now that's where it gets a bit complicated, and we need to harmonize a bit more. But this challenge that happens, and we have been trying to have it with the mid-year, to try to have a common understanding with the mid-year coordination summit. But this challenge that exists has to do actually with the nature of our REX. They are called regional economic communities, but increasingly they have been involved in peacemaking. But their initial task was regional economic integration. So, and then peace and security matter were relegated to the AU Continental Organization. So perhaps maybe we need to also look into that and have this conversation and figure out a way how to mutually reinforce each other rather than actually sometimes having a divergence of views, which actually does not help the country in crisis. On more concrete ways that member states can support the partnership, and not only our member states, but also our, it's really, there are so many ways. That first, in terms of human resources, management of partnership is really human resource intensive. It's a lot of work. It's not only about aligning politically in terms of what needs to be done, but it is also reporting, and some of you know this, reporting back in terms of making sure that we have our reports ready and so that our partners can also report back. So there is a lot of work. So in terms of human resources, the other element that is important, the African agenda is very clear. Let me just outline it here. One is peace and security. 2 is governance. 3, it's regional integration. 4, it's representation and effective voice. 5 is smart partnerships, strong and smart partnerships. So this is our current agenda, and I think that every supporting this and making sure that we have a common understanding of a crisis, and strategize together. One thing I have not seen of late is, or we don't do it enough, is strategizing together on how to do prevention and how to do conflict resolution. This is something that we need to get back to, where we have both unity of purpose. So, and I know that we have had some serious failures of late because of many reasons. But if the AU or the UN did not exist, as someone said, we will have to reinvent it. They still remain the platform through which we can address some of the multiple challenges that we have. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Fred. Gerald, any thoughts on this question of how member states can support the partnership?
Perhaps just briefly, and coming to some examples again, closer to home. And I think we do benefit from platforms such as the Group of Friends of the UN-AU partnership, currently co-chaired by Norway and Egypt, and that being a forum, for an informal forum for exchange on key and pressing issues with regards to the partnership, and certainly is a very clear expression of member state interest in the partnership and in trying to play a convening role and a supporting role in terms of key issues under discussion in the context of the partnership, and also providing a possibility when other members of the UN family are in Addis to also exchange with member states and to bring some of the issues that are being dealt with sort of under discussion. There's also been efforts and an interest in terms of, for example, Security Council member states represented in Addis to engage from time to time, and our SRSG has been very interested and willing to do so. The elected 10 have perhaps taken also quite an active role and have convened some meetings and tried to engage on some key issues, including this issue of PSO financing, which is under discussion this week in New York, a very, very important week on that key issue. And member states have been very involved and engaged and accompanied that issue over quite a period of time. And it's, I think, a good example on member state engagement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gerald. Okay, so we're going to wrap up now, and I will give each of the panel members 1 minute and only 1 minute, just to share their final thoughts, and then we'll conclude this this meeting. And I'll do it again in reverse order, starting with Solomon and then Fred, and then Gerald. So, final thoughts that you'd like to share with participants.
Before final thoughts, just a couple of thoughts on the earlier issue. I think in terms of preventive action, one of the points that the new agenda for peace makes, you mentioned it earlier, the nexus question. And for preventive action, one of the questions that we need to ask is, for prevention as well, one way or another, we often use what we call peace and security tools. Whether we like it or not, these tools tend to be primarily peace and security tools. So is there a possibility for bringing in and leveraging the non-peace and security tools, such as, those that speak to root cause dimension of issues, whether that is in terms of addressing development deficiencies, whether it is in terms of those interventions that help strengthen the capacity of local government institutions in delivering services. So I think we need to also look at how to leverage those kinds of non-peace and security tools that would also help to take this forward. And I think the whole question of obviously the UN has presence in all countries. I don't know the level of sharing of information that exists between the UN and the AU. Unlike the UN, the AU doesn't have presence in many countries, right? So, there are a few things that I think that that can be done there. Just final thoughts, a couple of points. One, I fully agree with Fred. If the UN didn't exist, I think it is one of those things that needed to be invented. And we need the UN more today than at the time of its establishment, perhaps. It is circumstances that led to, that necessitated its establishment on the ashes of the Second World War. And we need the UN more. And what that requires us, I think I fully agree with the Secretary General, is to reaffirm the centrality of the UN as that global, legitimate, inclusive platform where we have to seek solutions for the problems of the world. I think opting out of the UN to seek solutions undermines the UN, undermines trust in the UN. I think that is one. The other, more challenging dimension, to my mind, is including with the principle of that speaks to the principle of universality, the question of how accommodative would multilateralism be? So there is a scope of flexibility for multilateralism to accommodate diversity, right? So diversity of perspectives. Is there a possibility, given that we are in a very much more diverse, much more, multi-centered world that we are, as described by the Secretary General himself. Would that require us to also be much more, a multilateral system that is much more accommodative than the one that we have had so far? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solomon. Ambassador Fred.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Actually, I have some notes that I would like to share so that I can stay within 1 minute, because I had written this down. First, the UN and the AU partnership is strong and continues to grow and has never been more needed than now, as Solomon just mentioned. 2, we need to deal with self-censorship. 3, success of the partnership not only depends on the AUC and the UN secretariats, but also our member states. So we need to engage them more. 4, the primacy of politics cannot be understated. The UN and the AU, they need to foster greater coherence in fostering durable political processes. 5, we cannot neglect development and finance, and we need to address the reforms of the multilateral financial institutions and also the UN Security Council, which has been a pending issue. We look forward to the 2024 Summit of the Future and the 2025 Peacebuilding Review, and we welcome the forthcoming financing resolution this week, and we commend the A3 for leading this effort, and the AUC chairperson and Secretary General for their leadership over the years on this matter. Lastly, I can't thank enough Amani Africa for always having these great conversations and organizing them, and for the amazing publications. And I think that they deserve a very big round of applause. And I hope that they will also be able to organize such an event ahead of the AU Summit, which is scheduled for the 17th and 18th February next year. Thank you so much, and wishing you all a Merry Christmas for those who celebrate Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you very much. Gerald.
Thank you. And just very briefly in closing, perhaps just to reiterate that in order to grasp the potentials that may exist in the new agenda for peace, and to maximize opportunities in the vision laid out, and in that regard, perhaps taking the UN-AU partnership to another level, I think it's, again, important to recognize there is a very solid foundation in place. Certainly can be intensified and improved upon, but as colleagues have said, the partnership has never been more needed than it is now. And again, there is a very solid foundation in place to grasp the opportunities that the new agenda for peace may offer. And just very briefly in the context of the new agenda for peace, and as a very highlighted issue, the SG has put forward in terms of a new generation of peacekeeping missions, and recognizing the new realities and the need for a new response, and really a paradigm shift, that at the core of that approach, again, coming back to what's already been mentioned, but the necessity at the core of the response to peace and security, to have a political vision and the primacy of politics. And of course, in parallel to the peace enforcement approach, and the very important discussions that will be taking place later this week in New York. Of course, there also needs to be issues, as we've touched upon, I think, during the course of our discussion today, in terms of addressing other dimensions, in terms of governance deficits, in terms of development, and that the peace enforcement model, as important as it unnecessarily may be in some contexts, is not the only solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panel, and that brings us to the end of this event. I would like to, on your behalf, I would like to thank profoundly the panel, Mr. Gerald Mitchell, Ambassador Fred Gateretse-Ngoga, and Dr. Solomon Deso. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, your insights. This has been a very rich discussion. And thank you also for sharing your final thoughts. I think it really captured the essence of our discussion this afternoon, and also it provided some insights on the areas that we need to be focusing on as the AU and the UN in strengthening our partnership in peace and security. I'd like to thank all of you who have attended, both in person and virtually, and I thank you also for your very insightful and thoughtful questions. Apologies that we were not able to to answer all of them or address all of them, but I think this also speaks to the interest on this particular issue, Solomon, and I think there are a lot of areas in respect of the new agenda for peace and the AU and partnership that we haven't addressed today. And I think there's probably scope for at least another 2 further discussions. So we look forward to leveraging our collaboration as UN-AU and Amani Africa in order to organize some other additional discussions in the course of next year. I would like to also finally, and repeating what Fred said, thank Amani Africa. You have provided the platform for this discussion. And as Fred correctly pointed out, I think some of your research publications have been of immense value to the community here in Addis, including to the PSC and others. So I'd like to thank you very much for your contribution to some of these seminal discussions that we need to figure ourselves and think through in the months to come. So thank you all, and hope to see you again in the near future. And as Fred said, also wishing you all a happy end of year, and those who celebrate Christmas, wishing you a happy Christmas. Thank you. Sion.
All right, thank you. I think I was here to provide a more supportive role to facilitate the virtual conversations. I think, and I believe that virtual participants have been engaged throughout the conversations we had. So once again, thank you so much to all our participants. On behalf of Amani Africa and my team, I would like to say thank you to the UN-AU for collaborating with us on this very important discussion. And also once again to all of our partners, particularly the Norwegian Embassy, once again for providing support to make this event happen. So yeah, thank you so much. We do have coffee outside. Please join us as we continue some of the discussions. Thanks once again.